presentation.
High interest rates and high inflation have pushed many Canadians to face some difficult decisions.
Grocery bills and everything is very expensive.
I mostly rely on the food banks.
The federal government has promised targeted relief for those who need it most, but has also signaled the need for fiscal restraint. Priorities like dental care expansion and mental health transfers are what the NDP wants to see to maintain its deal with this government.
We must and we will meet this moment.
This moment remains one of great uncertainty, with the war in Europe now in its second year and the threat of a recession still looming. But there is also opportunity.
Canada will either capitalize on this historic moment or will be left behind.
Expect a Canadian response to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, with significant investments in clean energy technologies. This budget is a test for the government to balance today's challenges with its fiscal reality. This is the Federal Budget 2023.
Hello there, I'm Rosemary Barton, here live from the foyer of the House of Commons. Welcome to our CBC News special coverage of the federal budget. We are standing by to hear from Chrystia Freeland. Once she rises inside the House of Commons, we will be able to tell you more details from our reporters and our host, David Cochrane, about what is in that budget. But just moments ago, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister arrived with some hard copies of the budget and gave us a few words on what to expect. Let's listen in.
This year's budget, please. It's a plan for affordability for Canadians. It's a plan to support on health and on dental, and it's a plan to grow the middle class for a solid future with a growing economy. C'est un plan pour aider les Canadiens avec le coût de la vie. C'est un plan pour aider avec les soins dentaires et les soins de la santé. Et c'est un plan pour faire croître la classe moyenne dans un avenir positif et croissant.
Oui, c'est évidemment la réalité, Monsieur le Premier ministre, et j'ajouterais juste que notre plan pour la croissance, pour la classe moyenne,
it is a solid plan for the middle class, which will allow us to build a clean economy for the future.
Middle class and creating great middle class jobs is to build a clean economy of the 21st century.
Merci beaucoup.
There you go, a sense there from the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister of what to expect in this budget. We are standing by for Chrystia Freeland to rise to her feet, and at that moment we can tell you more about it. But because the Prime Minister showed you the cover, certainly I can do the same. It says a Made in Canada plan, strong middle class, affordable economy, healthy future. And certainly the themes that the government has signaled up to now, we know them well. Fiscal restraint, they say, will be demonstrated inside this document, as will some measures for affordability for Canadians. I see Chrystia Freeland on her feet now. Let's listen to the beginning of her speech, and then we'll bring in David Cochrane for the details of the budget.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 83.1, I'd like to table in both official languages the 2023 budget documents, including notices of Ways and Means motions.
Details of the measures are contained in these documents. Pursuant to Standing Order 83.2, I am requesting that an order of the day be designated for consideration of these motions. Seems a good idea, right?
I support that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, Canada's economy has made a remarkable recovery from the COVID recession. Last year, Canada delivered the strongest economic growth in the G7. There are 830,000 more Canadians working today than when COVID first hit. We have recovered 126% of the jobs that were lost in those first months, compared to just 114% in the United States. When we announced a Canada-wide system of affordable early learning and childcare in our 2021 budget, We said that it would create new economic opportunities for mothers all across Canada, and thus greater prosperity for all of us. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It worked. I am so proud to say that last month, the labor force participation rate for Canadian women in their prime working years hit a record high of 85.4%. That's feminist economic policy, Mr. Speaker. It works. So today, Mr. Speaker, there are more Canadians with good jobs than ever before.
Putin and the pandemic have driven up inflation all over the world. The central banks reacted by launching one of the swiftest and most synchronized cycles of monetary tightening since...
Okay, we will dip back into the speech as the finance minister continues to give it inside the House of Commons, but let me bring in the host of Power and Politics, David Cochrane. He was in the budget lockup all day, and he'll give us some of the significant details that have not been leaked, the other bits and pieces. David, what can you tell us?
There's not a whole lot, like Rosie. Yeah, we got a few more specifics on exactly what's in this budget. Let's start with the clean tech investments. A big part of this budget was responding to the moment of the clean transition that they want to have for the Canadian economy, but also the competitive challenges presented by Joe Biden and the Inflation Reduction Act. So in the window right now is $21 billion over the next 5 years, with a promise of escalating that to $80 billion by 2034, mostly in tax credits and subsidies to help with the green transition. There's tax credits there for clean energy, clean manufacturing, clean electricity projects, clean hydrogen, for carbon capture. And an interesting part of the electricity generation tax credits here, Rosie, is they're expanding this to public utilities. Hydro-Quebec, BC Hydro, Nalcor in Newfoundland and Labrador, Emera in Nova Scotia, which is a private company, can all avail of this to build new, clean, zero-emission energy transmission and generation. They're also offering financing through the Infrastructure Bank and grants through the Clean Growth Fund. And a key thing of all of this money is that it is tied to what they're calling the prevailing wage. So the higher the wage a company pays its employee, the higher the subsidy it will get. So this is very much out of Joe Biden's playbook on the clean transition. Here's what you're getting on healthcare. The big picture number is $198 billion over 10 years. We saw that. That was Justin Trudeau's deal with the premiers. There's money here for dental care. We're seeing the cost of Jagmeet Singh's plan and Jagmeet Singh's support. It's $13 billion over the next 5 years to fully implement the Canada Dental Plan, $4.4 billion a year after that. They're going to have the program stood up by the end of this year. It'll be fully implemented by 2025, living up to the conditions of the Confidence and Supply Agreement.
Yep.
On affordability, this is another key thing in this budget. They're offering what's called a grocery rebate. Now, this is in addition to the GST rebate that people get. Karina Roman, our colleague, broke this story yesterday. It's in addition to the GST, which you get 4 times a year. When this is passed, 1 time a year, $467 for a couple, $234 for a single, $225 for a qualifying senior. You don't have to spend it on groceries, Rosie, but it's being offered because of groceries. Now, all of this, the big bet of on the clean transition, the extra affordability money and the healthcare money, this is causing problems for the fiscal situation for the government. The deficit is still small as a percentage of GDP, around 1%, but it's a significant material change in the budget projections from what we saw last fall in the fall economic statement. You're looking at deficits of 43, 40, 35, 27, 16, and 14 billion. That's a shift from we were going to be in a $4.5 billion surplus under the old projections. We're now looking at deficits as far as the eye can see. The debt to GDP ratio is going up this year and next. So the fiscal anchor is coming up off the ground before bending back down. And the debt servicing, Rosie, is doubling over the cost of this. They pay $25 billion in interest payments last year to service the debt. By the end of this fiscal track, it's going to be $50 billion a year just to pay the interest on the debt.
So just to remind people, in the fall update, we had certainly a smaller deficit than had previously been predicted, but there was also an expectation of a balanced budget by 2028. So how do you explain why that has dissipated? The economy is softening, there's more spending?
It's two things. Yeah. It's a combination of the new spending, but even the fiscal projection that's in this budget, just to let people understand how the budget is made, in January, they get the finance department gets a consensus forecast from private sector banks and economists, and they use this as their baseline economic formula. Those numbers are more optimistic than the reality today. This forecast was done before Silicon Valley Bank went under, before the challenges happened with Credit Suisse. So there are warnings even in these numbers, as much as they've changed because the price of oil has gone down, the economy has slowed, that the chances of a soft landing in this economic turmoil is much lower than it was. The chances of a recession has gone higher, and there is significant risk to the downside of even these projections, to the point, Rosie, that GDP could be almost a full 2 percentage points lower if they hit the worst case scenario that they're
Okay, I can already anticipate some of the opposition reaction to those numbers. Thank you for that, David. Of course, we'll let you talk more in a moment. Let's go back inside the House and hear a little bit more from the Finance Minister.
We're investing in affordable childcare. From coast to coast to coast, so that more Canadians no longer have to choose between family and career. Investing in housing, skills, and immigration and childcare isn't just social policy. It's economic policy too, Mr. Speaker. The same thing goes for health care. So today, we are delivering the overall investment of $198 billion in our public health care system, which the Prime Minister announced just last month.
From helping every single Canadian find a family doctor, to tackling the unacceptable backlog of surgeries, to combating the opioid crisis that has devastated so many of our families and our communities, that has taken so many lives. We will ensure that Canadians receive the care they need. We will ensure that every single Canadian can rely on a world-class, publicly funded, universal health care system, one that is deserving of its place at the very heart of what it means to be Canadian. And just as we are reinforcing the public health care system we have today, we are also expanding its reach. Since December, our investments have helped more than 240,000 Canadian children receive the dental care they need. Just think about that, 240,000 Canadian kids. Maybe their parents couldn't take them to the dentist before. Maybe their teeth hurt. Maybe they missed days at school. It's so important. And that's why today I am so proud to announce the creation of a new Canadian dental care plan. By the end of this year, by the end of 2023, we will begin rolling out a dental care plan that will eventually cover up to 9 million uninsured Canadians. This will mean that no Canadian ever again will need to choose between taking care of their teeth and paying the bills at the end of the month. It will mean you can't tell the size of someone's paycheck by their smile.
Okay, we're going to pull back out of the speech here of the finance minister and come back in as needed. I'll bring in David Cochrane again to highlight a couple of the other bits and pieces in the budget. I did want to highlight this issue around foreign interference, which we didn't mention before, just because obviously it's been in the news so much. Yeah,
it's about $50 million, I think $49.8 million over 3 years. And it's primarily to help the RCMP beef up its investigative capacity to deal with and also to help protect vulnerable communities such as diaspora communities who are often targeted and victims of this foreign interference. So it's obviously a response to the news cycle over the past month and a half. But, we've heard policing experts like former Deputy Commissioner P.Y. Bordewog talk about the challenges of translating intelligence into an investigation and getting it to the level where it's evidence, where you can take criminal action against people who do this. You hear of the diaspora communities, the Chinese Canadian communities in particular, saying they have been targeted and can't get a lot of help. They want a hotline to be able to call in and deal with examples of foreign interference. There's a cash response in this, as well as money for the creation of a national director for counter interference. This is something that was announced the same day as the special rapporteur is going to live in public safety, which is Marco Mendicino's office. So there's money there, combined $65 million over the next 3 years to help set that up and try to push back against foreign interference, Rosie.
Okay, and just for people that may have missed you off the top, let's just give the big number, the deficit number again, only because it has changed since the fall. And that sure gives you a picture of the direction of the economy and where it might be headed. So I'll leave you for that.
So in November, this is the deficit now for the year for 2022-2023 is $43 billion. That's up from $36 billion. For 2023-2024, it's $40 billion, which is up from $30 billion.
So we have the wrong number there on that board.
Yes, so you're looking at it, or I wrote it down wrong on my notes. But you're looking at basically increases across the board.
Okay.
In November, deficits were going to decline from $36 billion to a surplus of $4.5 billion by 2027. Now we've got a deficit of $43 billion, declining to a deficit of $14 billion. So still staying in the red throughout this entire cycle. There has been a softening of the economy. There is uncertainty in revenues. They're expecting declines in income tax. Oil is down $20 a barrel from where it was in November to now. And we've had runs on the banks, for example, in the United States and in Europe, and all of that is changing the fiscal outlook. Plus, there's a new spending. Dental is fully implemented. There's a new healthcare arrangement, and there is a significant multi-billion-dollar response to the competitive challenges of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay, I'm going to put some of this to our friend Jimmy Jean, but first I just want to go over the grocery rebate again, because I think that will be of interest to a lot of Canadians, some of the people who are struggling the most with the inflation and high interest rates.
So this would be the centerpiece of the affordability measures. It's a grocery rebate that people will get in addition to the GST, and the qualifications and the amounts are based on the GST rebate, which people get quarterly. So once this is passed by Parliament, it's $2.5 billion, a maximum amount of $467 for a family. Now, this is in addition to the GST. As I say, Rosie, you get your next GST rebate payment on April 5th. If you're a single person who qualifies for this, you get $117. If you qualify for the grocery rebate, you'll get $234. So that's the number.
It's a one-time thing, though.
It's one time.
Yeah.
Now, they doubled the GST rebate last year. That was the measure. So this is equivalent to that, but it replaces that, and it's in addition to. So you'll get 4 GST rebates this year and 1 grocery rebate. So it's almost the equivalent of getting 6 GST rebates in the course of a single year.
Okay, that's good. That helps. Yep. Thank you for that, David. We'll come back to you. I'm going to bring in Chief Economist at Desjardins, Jimmy Jean, now, who has also been in the lockup. Nice to see you again, Jimmy Jean.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's noisy in there, but we'll try and get through it. I guess what surprises me most here is how dismal the fiscal picture seems to be, and the fact that the government is now not in a position to balance the budget, but is going to go further into deficit over the course of the next number of years. Give me your perspective on that outlook.
Right. There's no doubt that this is one of the big takeaways from this budget, not returning to a surplus. So that means deficits as far as the eye can see. And the other thing being that this is in consideration of a weaker economic outlook for sure. But at the same time, the budget does not make use of contingency reserves as it used to in the past. So that puts it more at risk of further deterioration if the outlook doesn't pan out as expected.
Jimmy John, will you stand by just for a minute? I'm going to go to the NDP there who's here already reacting. He has got a lot out of this budget. I'm sure that's what he's going to say. Let's go to him now. Here's Jagmeet Singh.
There's guarantees for good wages, good pay, and support for union jobs. Like, that's something that's never been done before, and we're proud of that. We're also, on a number of areas, not satisfied. that this government hasn't responded to the urgency of the housing crisis, that they haven't put in place changes to EI, given that we're up against a recession. So there's things that we're not satisfied by, but we're very proud of the work that we've been able to do.
So are you going to be supporting this budget is the big question.
Yes, we'll be supporting the budget. We're going to be supporting the expansion of dental care. We're going to be supporting giving people some money back in their pockets, helping them save money. We're going to be supporting the good wages tied to investments. We're going to be supporting the relief that Canadians deserve and that we force this government to deliver. En français. Oui, on va appuyer ce budget parce
we will be supporting this budget because there is an expansion of dental care to include seniors now and children under 18 and people with a disability. We forced the government to continued to double the GST tax credit, which means more money in people's pockets. And for the first time, we have connected investments by companies with good wages. So this is the first time we were able to get this guarantee that investments must be connected to good wages. We're proud of that, and we will support the budget.
Donc, on félicite, on est fiers des victoires.
We are proud of the victories that we secured. We're proud of the fact that dental care is there. We're proud of the fact that we forced the government to put more money in people's pockets. We're proud of all that. But at the same time, we are not satisfied with the inaction on the housing crisis, the inaction when it comes to improving other aspects of people's lives. But we are proud of what we were able to secure for people.
That we're in the agreement with the Liberals have been covered with the last two budgets. Where does this put you going forward in terms of leverage and supporting the Liberal government when most of the priorities have been introduced?
We're proud that we've been able to force this government to deliver things. And let me be very clear. There would not have been dental care in this budget but for New Democrats. There would not have been an expansion or a continuing of doubling the GST tax credit, which is the grocery rebate, but for the fact that we forced this government to deliver that. There wouldn't have been connections. There wouldn't have been clear ties between good jobs and investments in companies that are fighting the climate crisis, but for New Democrats. So we forced the government to do this. There's a number of things that still need to be done by the end of this year. We still need to see anti-SCAB legislation. We still need to see pharmacare legislation. And we're going to make sure this government delivers those things as well by the end of the year.
What about the lack of a mention of pharmacare in this budget? That's a big ask for your party.
Okay, we're going to pull away there from Jagmeet Singh, but the headline from his response is that they will support the budget in part because it does commit, as they had agreed to in their supply and confidence deal, to implement dental care on the timeline that they anticipated. They are also taking credit for that grocery rebate. This is, in fact, part, of course, why the NDP signed that agreement, is in order to try and take credit for some of the actions of the government. But that gives us one answer to a question that I don't think was at issue, but the government will not fall. There will not be an election because the NDP is happy enough with the budget here. Let's go back to, there's the finance minister speaking inside the House, but I'm going to go back to Jimmy Jean, the chief economist at Desjardins, just to get more of a picture of what we should make of this. Thanks for waiting there for me, Jimmy Jean. So as you said, it's not a super great fiscal picture. Can you tell us why that is? Is that sort of the state of the economy writ large? Is it a combination of that and government spending?
Exactly. There's the economy, where you do see some revisions. I think their real GDP forecast of 0.3% for this year is quite realistic, even though they don't seem so realistic when you look at the nominal GDP picture with inflation that is expected to continue to decelerate. So that means GDP inflation will continue to slow. We're actually more pessimistic on that front. But yes, indeed, a lot of that is due to higher spending, spending for clean energy, spending for affordability, and also for healthcare. So all those programs come at a price tag. There's a bit of an offset in terms of trying to find some savings in undertaking that strategic review or expanding that strategic review, as well as higher taxes, including on dividends. But it's not clear how much we'll be able to extract in terms of savings from those initiatives.
So the debt to GDP ratio, which has sort of remained what the government has looked to and pointed at in terms of its fiscal anchor. What are your concerns around whether it's really maintaining that moving forward, given the picture you've seen today?
Well, today we see that rising for the next fiscal year. That's a function of obviously weaker GDP, so the denominator factor in there. But at the same time, it seems like we're constantly pushing and delaying. And this anchor is specified as something in the medium term. But when you look at the near-term trajectory, even if over the medium term it's expected to be at acceptable levels, if we keep pushing and pushing the timeline, when it does get to an acceptable level, it steadily will lose credibility. So that's another concern we have in there. In addition to the fact that those deficits, even though we see them extended through the horizon, there's some significant downside risk because there's no more contingency for if things turn out to be worse than expected. So I think that will filter into a higher debt GDP profile should that be the case.
So just to clarify there, are you saying there's no reserve anymore? There's no buffer in case something goes wrong? No?
Right. They had 8.5 billion in total reserves in the last fall economic statement, and it seems that they've used that in order to offset the effect of the spending. So if it hadn't been for that, we would see even larger deficits. Obviously, this is a matter of fiscal prudence. It's been a practice that's been used by several governments. And I think it's something that ratings agencies and investors look at closely in terms of fiscal sustainability. Now, I think broadly speaking, Canada still looks good internationally speaking, but it's just some ways that corners are being cut, and that's something important to keep to watch for.
Jimmy John, always good to have you here. I appreciate your perspective. We'll come back to you if we have time. Thank you so much. Going to dip back into the House now and listen to the Finance Minister.
In the remarkable opportunities that Canada provides and in the new era of prosperity that we will build together. The brave people of Ukraine have reminded me, I think they've reminded all of us, that we must never take our freedom and our democracy for granted. We have the power to shape our country's future, and we must always be sure to use it. What a gift it is to call this remarkable country our home. Canada is a land filled with good, hard-working people. People who do big and important things. And it is because of us, the people of Canada, and the big and important things we will do in the months and years to come, that I have never been more optimistic about the future of our great country than I am today.
Okay, that is the Finance Minister. She's delivered her speech inside the House of Commons. Should tell you we're expecting a reaction from the official opposition, Pierre Poilievre, at around 4:45 or in about 15 minutes' time. Let me go back to David Cochrane now, because I did want to highlight one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, and that is that the government did do a spending review over the past year to see if there were places where they could pull out money or save money. And they did manage to do a little bit of that.
Yes, it's in a part of the budget called Effective Government and Improving Services to Canadians. And it's about it's about $10 billion in savings over a period of 5 years. A lot of this is going to stop the practice of relying so heavily on outside consultants. This has been a controversy here in Ottawa, the use of McKinsey, for example, Dominic Barton's former company, Canada's former ambassador to China. This has been the subject of endless parliamentary committees. And there's a question of why is the civil service growing at a certain rate and the amount of spending on outside consultants just absolutely skyrocketed under the Trudeau government. So that's going to be curtailed. There's a general rolling spending review that's going to happen inside government departments and also going to happen inside Crown agencies just to find ways to save money and reprofile, to use the budgeting term, programs that aren't being used are either cut and eliminated and the money is saved or it's poured into other things. And the other thing they're doing too, Rosie, is they're making some changes to the tax system. I don't know anybody who's in the category who pays the alternative minimum taxes for the super wealthy who'd find ways to use deductions to reduce their tax payments to the government
out there, though.
by a ludicrous amount. They're putting a floor underneath that in a way that they think will capture more revenue to sort of offset some of the new spending. And they're also like bringing in this tax. They promised people to do stock buybacks or increase dividends as a way. They're increasing the tax on that to try to encourage people, instead of just juicing your share price, to pour that money into productivity and use it in company investment. Here's an example of something that's gone, not renewed in this budget. We talked about affordability. The grocery rebate is there. That's almost like a doubling of the GST like we saw last time. Remember the $500 top-up for rental assistance?
For housing,
Gone. Eliminated in this. So something that people pointed to is something they wanted, $500 to help them deal with high housing costs. I was told inside the lockup by an official, the budget lockup, not a jail lockup, that this was an undersubscribed program. People just weren't using it. They weren't signing up for it. They didn't know how to necessarily get it. So they've eliminated it, and they're rolling that money into things like the grocery rebate that people automatically qualify for because of the way the tax filing system works.
Well, that could
to
mean
make
that
sure
the
they get the
program
money.
wasn't well designed as well.
Well,
but
that could be it. There's an interesting thing, too, that starting next year, they're going to do automatic tax filing for low-income Canadians. So this is important. You know, not only does it stop them from doing taxes, but or stop them from having to do taxes. The only way to qualify for so many government assistance programs is to file an income tax return and be means tested. By automatically doing that, you automatically qualify for the programs. So people at the bottom of the economic ladder will be automatically filed, automatically enrolled, and will get things like the low-income workers benefit automatically with this new filing program that's going to come in next year.
I was looking, and I'm still catching up, obviously, from where you were, but I do believe there's a substantive amount of money for Indigenous housing, is there not?
There's about $5 billion or $4.9 billion over 5 years for that. But here's another thing that's not in the budget. So this is for Indigenous housing. There's no new housing money in this budget. The big housing policy, the housing crisis that's happening in this country. What is happening is the Housing Accelerator and the First-Time Home Buyer Savings Plan that were announced in last year's budget, those are coming into force this year. They're coming on stream. So last year's signature policies come to life this year. And,
so we'll see something from them.
We'll see some activity from that, but there was a recognition in there that they chose to go heavily in critical minerals and clean transition. There's going to need to be a bigger focus on housing in future budgets.
Okay, David, thank you again. Guess what? At Issue is here already. We're going to talk to them later tonight on the National as well, but let's get their first take on things. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea, good to see all of you. Chantal, I'll start with you because you popped up there first on my screen. What is your first sort of thoughts after hearing and looking at it?
That the government was caught between two opposite political necessities. One was to keep the NDP on side and avoid an election, and the other was to send a message of fiscal discipline that would convince skeptical Canadians that they are prudent fiscal managers. It seems the let's make sure we don't have an election school prevailed, and hence you have a deficit that is much higher than forecast last fall, but also much spending on an NDP promise, i.e. the dental care program.
Andrew, your takeaway?
Well, you remember last year your budget had that striking chart showing that Canada would have the slowest rate of growth in the OECD over the next 40 years. And that seemed to signal that maybe the government was going to start taking growth more seriously. That hope, slim as it was, has been dashed in this budget. You would think if you were talking about growth agenda, you'd be trying to get your deficits down, you'd be trying to get taxes down, you'd be trying to liberalize your economy, make it more competitive, less distorted by subsidies. And instead what we get in this is larger deficits thanks to much higher spending. Spending on average over the next 5 years will be $30 billion more a year higher than was projected just 12 months ago. You've got higher taxes, you've got all kinds of subsidy schemes that are going to distort the economy even further. This is really an anti-growth budget, not a pro-growth budget.
The clean energy moves there, Andrew, does that not contribute to your concerns around growth, or you think that's sort of free money throwing at companies?
It is going to go, it's interesting, the budget specifically says, oh, this isn't about picking winners between corporations. No, it's just about picking winners when it comes to whole industries and technologies. Every time you do that, you're doing so at the expense of other industries and other technologies. You are picking winners, and governments do not have a good track record in that.
Althea, your thoughts?
Well, they're also allowing themselves to pick winners directly through the Strategic Innovation Fund. And maybe other pools of money, bespoke money they talked about, like the Volkswagen deal that is multiple billions of dollars that are going beyond the 5-year fiscal framework that is in this budget into the next 10 years, maybe even more. We don't really know because they haven't told us anything. But François-Philippe Champagne, the innovation minister, keeps talking about how there is all these companies on his phone really wanting similar deals to Volkswagen. Well, we cannot afford to give them similar deals to Volkswagen. And there's no discussion in here about a possible cap. And one thing that's really interesting is that they talk about the IRA. And in the IRA, the Congressional Budget Office, which is basically like the parliamentary budget officer in Washington, said, okay, we think this is going to be worth about $370 billion. And then Goldman Sachs, just last week, came out and said, we think it's actually going to be worth $1.2 trillion because there's more uptake than we expected, and some of these programs aren't capped. And this is a risk in this budget as well. We're putting so much money out there, but we're not limiting the amount of money that we think it is. In fact, the government says we're hoping we're reaching that balance, and if we don't reach it, we'll go back to the drawing board. Those tax credits might be worth more, they might be worth less. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And in some ways, this is like a make-believe budget. I mean, they all are, but this one seems particularly more than most.
Well, let's go back to the politics of it, Chantal, because given the state of the economy globally, and I guess this is a budget that hopes that things are going to improve in the world by the time they get to a spot where they might need to have an election. Is that how I should read that?
Well, up to a point, but budgets aren't about hopes for that things will turn out well and that it won't be a complete fiasco to be doing whatever is in the budget. What strikes me, the other thing that strikes me about the budget is how little actual original liberal thinking there is in it. If you look at its big pieces, so set aside the healthcare deal, induced by the provinces. You've got one of the co-writers, Jagmeet Singh, so it's dental care, but also inflation relief. And then the whole section about clean technology, well, you saw that co-author. He was on Parliament Hill on Friday, getting standing ovations in the House of Commons, and he's called Joe Biden. But once you strip all that away, you are left with very little sense of a government fiscal direction beyond more deficits and what you called hope, which to many Canadians will sound a bit like a Hail Mary pass whose outcome we cannot bank on.
So Andrew, I was talking to Jimmy Jean there, the chief economist for Desjardins, who has concerns around the debt to GDP ratio as fiscal anchors and them sort of floating away as anchors, as it were. I know that's also of a concern to you. What was in there that worried you?
Well, it's contradictory language. The budget claims that they're sticking with the fiscal anchors, even as it's very clear in the numbers they're not. So they're sticking with it unless it's inconvenient to do so, in which case they abandon it. So no, the debt to GDP ratio is not going down. It's going up in the next year, and maybe for the next 2 or 3 if we get worse than expected economic numbers in the next little while, which we may well with all the turmoil in the banking system. So it's really a kind of a wing and a prayer kind of thing. But as many people have complained, this government really doesn't seem to have any kind of meaningful fiscal anchor that people can kind of take to the bank. At one point when they were back in 2015, they were going to balance the budget in 4 years. They got rid of the balanced budget pledge because that was too constraining. So, declining debt to GDP ratio means you just have to run deficits small enough that the debt doesn't grow faster than the economy. And even that is now proving to be too confining for them. So we're going to finance a bunch of stuff that may or may not be good programs. You can debate about the merits of a lot of these programs, but what's true about virtually all of them is they're not the sort of thing you go into debt to finance. More transfers to the provinces may be a good idea, but you should be financing that with current taxes, not with more borrowing. And that, unfortunately, is back to where we're back to.
Chantal wants in there quickly. I'll go to Althea, and then I got to wrap it up. Chantal?
Okay, I don't think they so much lack a fiscal anchor as the discipline to stick to it. And that is an interesting but disquieting move. What's the point of an anchor if it doesn't anchor you?
Althea?
Yeah, I mean, I would say to Andrew's point, like when you look at how much is there's actually spending, most of the big spending is actually not even in this fiscal framing. Like all these tax credits, they're booked for after the 5-year time horizon in this budget. So we don't really have a good idea, the public does it, of what the cost of this budget really. And when you think about in 5 years, the budget deficits that we'll be running, $50 billion, that's more than we put extra in the health accord with the provinces. So these decisions actually have, they mean something. The other thing I'd like to say is that one thing that struck me from this budget is that a lot of the things that the Conservatives have been hammering the Liberals on for months, in fact maybe almost a year, is some of the inabilities of the Liberals to get governing right, things like the passport office, the backlogs with the veterans. The government is spending a lot of money addressing the airport delays, like billions of dollars. So there is a nod here that they have listened to Canadians who've been very frustrated, and the argument that they're kind of weak when it comes to getting the things the government is supposed to do right, and addressing that.
Last word to you, Chantal, then I got to go.
Yes, they're addressing the airport situation by making airplane tickets more expensive. Great.
Okay, I think they all have more to say, so they'll all say it later on The National. Thank you all. Appreciate your first take, Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. Chantal made Andrew chuckle there at least 3 times, and that's unheard of, so we'll watch everybody later.
On a budget.
I'll just dip into the House here. Pierre Poilievre is on his feet, giving part of his official response in the chamber. Let's listen in for a couple of moments, although he is going to scoot out after to talk to the media.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Inflation made a statement last year. She said, "Allow me to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. We are absolutely determined to ensure that our debt-to-GDP ratio continues to decrease. We will make sure of that, Mr. Speaker." Here we are, a year later. That was not accomplished. It's interesting because just a few days ago, she admitted that deficits fuel inflation. Today, she's tabling a budget with $43 billion in additional spending that will be paid for through taxes and taxpayers. Conservatives work for those who work, and that's why we will vote against this inflationary plan, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, there's the headline you needed there from Pierre Poilievre. Not surprisingly, the Conservatives will vote against the budget. Pierre Poilievre will come into the foyer shortly and make a statement and take some questions for the media. We'll bring that to you live. I'm going to bring in another guest if I can now. Flavio Volpe is standing by, I believe. There he is, the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. Nice to see you, Mr. Volpe. Thanks for making time.
Thanks for having me on.
We wanted to talk to you, obviously, because there is so much money and effort here in this budget to push towards a clean economy and much of it into clean electricity. I don't know what you've had time to look at or be briefed on yet,
Sure.
but I wonder what that signals for you.
So there's a few things for me here. There's investments in clean infrastructure. There's a 15% tax credit for clean energy projects. That I think is very important, sets the kind of foundation. You know, the business that we're in is making electric cars. What are real zero-emission cars? We're the ones that draw energy for charging from clean sources, and I see the federal government investing heavily into that. Of course, the jurisdiction is provincial, but providing the capital to be able to have that work. Then extraction of, you know, these critical minerals that we always talk about. Well, if you extract them in a way that is inefficient, you're just adding the carbon footprint. And so we see an investment there. And then really importantly, we'd been asking, sorry, Rosie, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Volpe, go ahead, sorry.
We'd been asking for a strategic response to the IRA, where, you know, we saw Joe Biden last week talk about this partnership. Canada got into EV tax credit after we renegotiated when we were out. We didn't pay anything for it. We didn't match their incentives. We knew that for the types of tax credits they do for clean manufacturing, like battery production, we have to respond. We'd been saying, don't cast the net wide like the Americans did. where there is no actual budget. You know, we heard, I think, Althea talk about $300 billion estimate there, or that could be as high as $1.3 trillion. What we saw in the budget today was a response with a 30% investment tax credit.
Yep.
That does have a fence around it. It says $4.5 billion until 2028, and then $6.6 billion for the next 5 years in there. I think that reflects the reality of how many of these investments we can swallow as a country and then be productive on. And I was glad to see the discipline of a number there.
Do you think that this is an adequate response to what President Biden has put forward, given that we simply don't have the kind of capital that he has?
Yes, and it reflects how many of these battery and electric vehicle investments we can swallow as a proportion of the North American footprint. We have 1/10 the population they do, but I think in the industry here we said we think we could swallow 20% of the production. This could help accommodate it. And I listened last week to the language from the president, and I know that our team was down in Washington the week before. They were working on it. I think he signaled it. We have to pay to be part of the dance, but I think we got in for a very good envelope.
Okay, Flavio Volpe, thank you for making the time for us. Appreciate it so much. Good to get your perspective.
Thank you, Rosie.
Good to see you. All right, I'm going to bring back David Cochrane as we stand by for Pierre Poilievre, who I think has exited the chamber and will appear shortly. So I may cut you off abruptly, but off you go.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what that issue was talking about, what Flavio Volpe was talking about. And this is the $21 billion over 5 years that's in this budget for the clean transition, with a promise of $80 billion in federal spending by 2034. Now, this is primarily tax credits, Rosie. This is not subsidies like into a project like maybe we're going to find out with a Volkswagen plant in St. Thomas.
It's write-offs.
Exactly. But it's designed to attract capital and spur that investment. The Finance Department estimates that we need about $100 billion a year as a country in capital investment right now. We just aren't getting that kind of weight in this transition. Now, the difference between what's happening here and with Joe Biden and the Inflation Reduction Act, they have a lot of production credits in their plan. For every unit of clean energy you create, you get something from the federal government. Here, it's for the investments that you make. Now, the argument from the government in favor of this is that it leaves the decision in the marketplace.
Right.
So, going back to the question of are you picking winners and losers? Andrew was right when he says they're picking a particular sector, but that sector's kind of been picked. Electric vehicles, electric batteries, semiconductors, critical minerals. That is where this inflection point economic, exactly, and also just accelerate domestic growth to be part of it, right? So that's where they're going there. They're also got some what they call strategic finance from the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Canada Growth Fund. Together, they're going to have about $35 billion to invest in projects that spur the green transition, and this is going to be low-cost financing. What's interesting here is the Canada Growth Fund promised in the budget last year, but only stood up now this spring to start doing things. It's not going to be run by government. It's going to be run by the Public Service Pension Board. So they're used to making investments. They're looking at managing this sort of thing, and that's where the decision is going to lie. So it depoliticizes the decision-making process. Obviously, it's got a focus of being on clean transition, but that's where that's going to go. And the other key thing is that all of these subsidies on the tax credits are going to be tied to what's called a prevailing wage. On Friday, when we listened to Joe Biden, he talked about good union jobs and good union wages. What they're talking about here is they will subsidize at a higher rate companies that pay a wage equivalent to the broad-based unionized wage in that sector, including pension benefits and including other benefits. So it's an incentive for these companies to pay better, and it also lowers a barrier to unionization potentially in these sectors.
As we wait for Mr. Poilievre, tell me, is the Poilievre clause, was that contained in the budget? This thing where you couldn't undo certain subsidies unless you paid companies back or something like that?
It's there, and the way it works, it applies to the Clean Growth Fund that I talked about. So it applies to the direct financing contracts that come in that. So essentially that if someone takes on the risk of investing in green transition and it makes them less competitive than someone who chooses not to invest in the clean transition, they're putting in a contract language that if a future government cancels the carbon price, because that would be the competitive disadvantage, they have to subsidize the company for the loss and the risk that they have taken off.
This is legislation they're going to propose.
But they're looking to expand it across the whole sector. So if a trucking company upgrades to an electric vehicle fleet to get away from the carbon price on fuel, and then the carbon price is eliminated on fuel, and that puts them at a capital disadvantage, they are exploring options to find a way to make the federal government liable for that. It's very similar to the Saudi LAV deal that the Harper government signed. Remember the LAVs that were being made by General Dynamics in London? The Liberals took a lot of heat over this. They said the clause to cancel it was so prohibitive they had to allow it to go. They're trying to take that sort of tactic and bake it into carbon-friendly measures.
Although this wouldn't do anything to the individual, like the family carbon tax, the carbon tax on the individual. So the Conservatives could still go ahead and
absolutely.
Axe that.
So this would be industrial and business, and it has to do with that because one of the issues right now is that there is some uncertainty and there is some risk politically, and people, investors don't like risk and they don't like uncertainty, and you have to make a 10 or 20-year horizon investment, to get your return on investment and cost savings over time on these sort of green technology investments, even with tax credits, even with subsidies, even with low-interest government financing. It's a challenge you take on. They want that security and protection, and the Liberals are exploring a way to give it to them.
Yeah, and I think companies had been asking for some signs of how they would know what the future was going to bring. It will respond to that, although probably not make the Conservatives or people who don't believe in carbon pricing very happy at all. Just to bring you up to speed on where we are, the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, has already come out and told us that he will support the budget. That's not surprising, given that a lot of the components that he asked for as part of his supply and confidence agreement were met in this budget. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, who will be coming out shortly, says he will not support the budget. And speaking now, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, François Blanchet. Let's listen to him a little bit to see where he stands.
An economy which is really an absolute copy of the Falls economic statement. Let's deal with some fundamental elements right off the top. We have already established that we will not accept the agreement between the provinces and Quebec and the federal government. And the fact is, the transfers were inadequate in our opinion, and particularly since they did not meet the demands of Quebec and Canada with respect to 35%, so we are not satisfied. There is absolutely nothing in this budget for seniors aged 65 to 75 to receive the same amount as seniors over 75, including that benefit. There is no reform to the EI program, no improvement for people who are contributing but getting nothing. Many of the contributors receive nothing. And there is also an extraordinary illustration of the fiscal imbalance. Last year, the government accumulated a sum that was budgeted but which was not actually spent, some $40 billion. And they're saying this year that they're going to have a deficit of $40 billion. So let's understand each other. One cancels out the other. So in fact, the federal government is announcing deficits. The second fundamental point is that they are using the fiscal imbalance, in other words, the flexibility there, to make energy investments that could end up being a place for whitewashing these investments in the sense that we will never know who benefits from them. So there is money that will be used for carbon capture and sequestration, something that doesn't actually work, for gray hydrogen from the West, which will be hidden in so-called investments in clean energy, which will support the nuclear energy, which is certainly not clean energy. So some $21 billion, which will go in support, indirect support to oil companies. And through this fiscal imbalance, which we can explain this way, the government is collecting too much money in taxes compared to its actual government obligations, whereas the provinces are not collecting enough money in taxes compared to their obligations and responsibilities. The government is announcing that in 30 to 40 years it will have eliminated the federal debt altogether, whereas according to the parliamentary budget officer, in 30 to 40 years, there will be Canadian provinces that will have failed, that will be bankrupt, and the fiscal situation of the provinces will have deteriorated to an irrecoverable level.
Okay, that is the leader of the Bloc Québécois, Yves-François Blanchet, who does not seem overly thrilled with the budget either. Points to some of the things that he thinks are missing around spending for seniors and how it will affect provinces. I'll bring back David Cochrane as we again wait for the Conservative leader to come out and give us his take, which we know is, I don't like this budget, but the specifics of that. And you have another issue you want to discuss around debt.
Well, this is something I think Pierre Poilievre is going to seize on quite significantly.
Andrew Coyne, too.
Yes, of course. If you look at the debt servicing costs, I mean, obviously historic deficits, the doubling of the national debt to respond to the economic and medical and health challenges, societal challenges brought on by COVID. In 2021, 2022, the interest on the debt was $25 billion using round numbers. By the end of this fiscal forecast, it's going to be $50 billion. It's going to completely double. So over 5 years, on debt servicing alone, the government of Canada is going to spend $235.2 billion just on interest. Right? Consider that the 10-year health agreement is $198 billion over 10 years. This is $235 just over 5.
Yeah.
Now, that's a net increase on the extra debt of about $130 billion. But it shows you the challenge that we're facing. Because Jimmy Jean made this point. The economic outlook is probably too positive in this budget compared to what has happened since the assumptions were put in place. There is no contingency fund in the financial projections, so the deficit is conceivably higher. Like, it would have been lower had they gone with that practice in years past. So they're making a big bet on tax credits to have this fundamental economic transition that they say is absolutely vital to the future success of the country. While they've already locked in massive spending for health care and now dental care, they've got a growing liability in terms of interest on the debt they have to deal with, and the language in the budget makes it quite plain that the economic assumptions have gotten worse, far worse since January, when issues started with the banking sectors in the US and in Europe. So there's a lot riding on this. They're making a big bet on upside economically while staring quite significantly at downside risk economically and fiscally.
So I'm sure you'll put this to Chrystia Freeland, but what is the rationale behind not having a reserve fund, a little cushion there to protect you, given that we know that it is typical, really, for governments to do that to some extent, just there's not enough money?
I don't know, or they wanted to keep the numbers sort of like as reasonably as low as possible, or really what's the point? Because everybody looks at the budget and goes, well, they got a $4 billion contingency reserve, so really the deficit is this. So I guess the hope is to try to beat these numbers, right? Hope that economic growth is better, but they do say that the risk of of not having a soft landing, because people are worried economically. We have a soft landing, which is either avoiding a recession or a short, shallow recession or a hard landing. They think it's increasingly less likely we get that soft landing, so we're going to get something rough.
David Cochrane will be with you at the top of the hour here to bring you more coverage, including an interview with the Finance Minister. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks for watching our special coverage here of CBC News and CBC News Network. See you later tonight on The National.